Good morning. My name is John Pauly. I'm the pastor of group development here at Grace Valley Fellowship, and I'd like to welcome you to our July 4th service. I want you to imagine with me a beautiful scene. I'm not talking about scenery like going out to a lake or up into the mountains. I'm talking about something that you've seen maybe in a movie or a TV show or as you read in a novel. And as the author or the producer, director present the scene, you're almost moved to tears because it's what the scene that's captured there is so beautiful. Let me, to help you get your creative juices flowing, offer a few examples. So one movie that comes to mind for me is The Shawshank Redemption. And there are a number of scenes in that movie where you could be moved to tears or to laughter. I think of Andy Dufresne after he has climbed out the sewer pipe and is now standing in the ditch with his arms raised and the rain hitting him. Or for those of you who like romantic comedies of the 1990s era, You've Got Mail with Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks, the final scene where their eyes meet each other. Or how about a classic Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life. George Bailey is standing in his living room with friends standing around singing. And those are movies, scenes that are just beautiful. I still sometimes tear up at some of these. But the one I want to share with you this morning is maybe a little bit offbeat, but it's the movie The Sting, a really old one. And it's the climax scene. I'll recount it for you the best I can. The feds come in to arrest Henry Gondorf, played by Paul Newman. Robert Redford, his character's name is Johnny Hooker, is lying dead on the floor, blood oozing out of the corner of his mouth. His partner, Gondorf, had just shot him in the back, thinking that Hooker had snitched on him. Gondorf is shot by the chief Fed agent, and he too is lying dead on the floor. You can see the blood on his shirt. The man that they had marked, Doyle Lonigan, the crime boss, he is hustled out of the gambling parlor by a crooked cop, Lieutenant William Snyder. But both the people that we had grown to love and appreciate in this movie, Gondorf and Hooker, were dead. The crime boss is being escorted out of the building scot-free. All just went terribly wrong. And I remember sitting in the theater that evening thinking to myself, no, the movie just can't end this way. The sting on Lonigan went sideways. But then FBI agent Polk leans down over Johnny Hooker and says, he's gone. Redford opens his eyes and spits out the red ink packet in his mouth. Now, I'm sitting in a theater in Colorado Springs with some friends on a Saturday night, and as that happens, the audience erupts into cheers and laughter and clapping. This is something I had never experienced before. The audience was so swept up in the emotions of what had happened. They had just been taken down to the depths of desperation and then brought back up to life. The sting was complete. All the loose ends had been neatly tied up. Gondorf and Hooker took Lonigan for $500,000, which was a lot of money back in those days. The crooked cop who had been tailing Hooker thought he was dead. Doyle Lonigan thought that both Hooker and Gondorf were dead. 1973 is when I saw that movie. And now 50 years later, I still remember it, and I still remember the audience's reaction to that scene. What is it about these scenes? Whether it's Andy Dufresne standing in the drainage ditch with the rain falling on his face, or he and Red embracing on the beach in Mexico in the final scene of the movie. What is it about it when Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks meet in that park? And you remember Meg Ryan's face. She could do so many things with just facial expressions. They start playing Somewhere Over the Rainbow. What is it about it when George Bailey is standing in his living room and his friends are coming in, putting money on the table, and they're singing Old Lang Syne, and everything is going to be all right? What is it? Is it a sense of completeness, wholeness, restoration? Is it that wrongs were righted, the evil vanquished, and the good guy is standing victorious? Is it that we've seen our heroes suffer, but now they are at peace and rest, they are victorious? Is it just that there is a sense of this is the way things ought to be? Well, good questions. I want to draw your attention this morning to a scene that is even more beautiful than any of the ones that I have just described. This is a picture that I've returned to over and over again. I came to Christ when I was in elementary school. I was a church kid, sometimes an angry church kid. I went to youth group, church summer camp, Bible college, seminary. I was ordained in 1977 and pastored a church for over 6 years. I have read the gospel accounts too many times to count. No telling how many times I've come across this story, but every time I come across and see this picture, my soul is refreshed. Every time I see this picture, I exhale and I sense a calmness come over my soul. It's something that just stops me in my tracks. No doubt with just a bit of analysis, it would become obvious why I, with my life experiences and personality type, react to this passage as I do. But I digress. Here, you're dying to wonder what this picture is, what this scene is. And so here it is. Mark chapter 5, verse 15. Quoting, "When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons, sitting there, dressed, and in his right mind." Why is this moment so sweet? This picture of this man. Now, to fully enter into this beautiful moment, I want us to view this as we would in a movie. And so the action freezes at that moment. The scene of Legion sitting still, calm, and fully dressed fades from the screen. And now what we see on the screen are the words 2 years earlier, and we are taken into a flashback. We see on the screen an ordinary man walking down the street of a town, and we hear a voiceover say, "We know him only as the Gerasene demoniac. Legion is not really his name. We do not know his name or hardly anything about him, but from what Mark tells us, we can infer that he once lived in Gerasa. He could well have had a wife and children and lived in a 3-bedroom ranch house in the suburbs. But one day, those closest to him began to notice changes. There were the fits of rage and the moments of incoherence, unexplainable behavior, moments when he just wasn't himself. He would disappear for hours without explanation. Some nights he would be gone all night. These nighttime absences were the worst, because in the still of the night, his wife and children would be woken from a fitful sleep by shrieks and screams, and they would swear that the sounds they were hearing were those of a familiar voice. When he would return, he would be exhausted, absolutely spent, drained of all energy and emotion. Sometimes his clothes were torn and tattered. At other times there were cuts or bruises or on his arms or legs or neck. But his family did everything they could to continue to live a normal life. They adjusted their patterns and tried to give him extra space. Your father is going through a difficult time right now, kids. Let's just do everything we can to make things easy for him, Mom would say. They would make excuses or offer explanations for this behavior to themselves and their neighbors. But things got worse. The absences grew longer, the behavior more erratic. Finally, he stopped coming home altogether. He had lost his job, and now he lived in the streets. He always seemed to be on the move. He seemed driven, unable to stand still, sometimes ranting, screaming, cursing. At other times, he seemed to be aware of no one or nothing. He would wander down the street, contained in his own little world. his eyes glazed over, his mind obviously somewhere else. He ate whatever he could get his hands on. All civilized traits soon disappeared. He did not care how he looked, or how he smelt, or where he went to the bathroom. People would snicker or whisper, but usually they would give him a wide berth. But then it got too much even for him to be wandering around the streets of the town. Maybe by this time his tattered and torn clothes had fallen off altogether. We don't know if the people of the city could no longer tolerate his presence within their streets and ran him out of town, or whether he became like a wild animal and was unable to live within the cage of the city walls. Regardless, now he lived out in the open spaces. He roamed around like an animal, but seemed to have claimed the cemetery as his home territory. He would lurk by the road that went past the cemetery, harassing any unfortunate soul who came by. Well, this was just too much for the town fathers to bear. Maybe first he was a town joke, then an embarrassment, but he finally became an inconvenience. Something had to be done. Someone came up with the idea of chaining him up and setting a guard over him. He had to be kept where he couldn't bother anybody. But numerous attempts to keep him bound in chains failed. He was so strong, he would break the chains like they were strings and run away, ultimately returning to the graveyard. Finally, the entire town of Gerasa gave up on him, and they left him to himself out among the tombs and did their best to avoid him. But they could never completely forget about him. They altered their travel plans. When they were taking the road down toward the sea, you'd have to take another route. Every now and again, the guys who herded the pigs on the hill opposite the cemetery would come into town with their latest crazy man story. And even though he was out of sight for most of the town folks, sometimes in the quietness of the night, they could hear his tormented shrieks. And so it was, this nameless man, once a citizen of Gerasa, was now no longer able to function within that community. He ran naked, like a tormented wild animal, and in the darkness of his soul, he lived among the dead. But then one day, a boat pulled up to the shore, and a small band of Jews got off. Our nameless man knew immediately that one of these passengers on the boat was not an ordinary man. He sensed in the depths of his soul that something unique was true about this man. Something thrusts him toward this man. He goes running. This time his goal was not to threaten or harass. He ran up to the stranger and yelled as loudly as he could, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" The demons that had taken over this man's soul recognized Jesus for who he was and knew what he was capable of doing. "I beg you, don't torture me." But Jesus had no wish to torture or harm our nameless man from Gerasa. His desire was to set this man free, to bring sunlight to a soul too long darkened by the forces of evil. The demons implored Jesus that they not be sent out of the area. Rather, they begged Jesus to allow them to take up residence in the herd of pigs nearby. Jesus granted them their wish. The evil spirits left the man, went into the pig herd. The animals did not know what had happened to them, and they panicked and ran down the hill and into the sea and drowned. But let's not get caught up in the scene of the pigs running or drowning. Let's turn our attention back to the nameless man. That's where Mark wants us to look, and he is very deliberate in describing him. He writes, "He was sitting, dressed, and in his right mind." This man who for so long could not sit still but roamed about like a caged animal was sitting. But it wasn't just that his body had come to rest. Luke's telling of the story says that he was sitting at Jesus' feet. He was in the position of a student, a disciple, no longer unable to concentrate, listen attentively, or learn, our nameless man was sitting at Jesus' feet, soaking up the words of our Lord. He was sitting at Jesus' feet, and he was clothed. This man from Gerasa, who for so long had roamed the hillsides naked, unaware or unconcerned about how he looked or smelled, now sat clothed. And Mark tells us he was in his right mind. Now, we must not think that this man was suffering from any psychological maladies and that Jesus had miraculously restored him to mental health. No, when Mark says that he was in his right mind, he means to tell us that this nameless man, who had been turned almost into an animal by the powers of evil, whose mind and spirit and soul had been so twisted and contorted by the work of Satan, whose entire life had been ruined by demonic forces, this man, by the miraculous power of God, was now fully human. His soul and spirit and mind were in harmony. He was at peace with himself and the God who had created him. He was now seeing things clearly. He was truly in his right mind. No longer was his soul shrouded in darkness, and he was now basking in the light of God's grace and love and mercy. The flashback is complete, and now we have come back full circle to the scene where we first encountered this man. But now we come at it from the perspective of the townsfolk, and the camera is following them as they come out of the town toward the scene. The camera pans across the shoreline, and we see dead pigs floating on the beach. The camera takes us through the eyes of the townfolk to the focal scene, Legion, sitting, clothed, and in his right mind. Darkness to light, chaos to order, frenzy to calm, and they saw Jesus. The swineherders recounted the entire incident, the Jews coming up to the shore, the encounter between Legion and Jesus, the negotiation between the demons and Jesus, Jesus releasing the demons and giving them permission to enter the pigs, the ensuing chaos and the herd of 2,000 pigs rushing down the hill. Now you see the people looking back and forth. On one hand, they see devastation, the pigs. On the other hand, they see Legion, a calmness and a wholeness that they had not seen. He was a man, a new man, a whole man, restored. And now the action moves forward. And what are the next words that Mark writes? We would imagine that maybe they erupted in cheers. They applauded. They went and hugged their old neighbor. But Mark says that they were afraid. Their reaction was fear. You know, the Bible talks about the fear of God. Here are a few examples. Psalm 33:8, let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the peoples of the world revere him. A very familiar passage, Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. These talk about a reverence and awe, a sense that we are in the presence of a powerful and holy God. But what we see on the lakefront that day is not holy fear. Rather, it is an unholy fear. And the response, the reaction, then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. They wanted Jesus to leave. We don't know exactly why, but I believe that they saw in that scene their lives turned upside down. They had an uneasy equilibrium. Jesus' Legion was in his place and relatively contained. He was pretty much out of the way. He didn't interfere with their lives. But that sense of fragile stability had been shattered and upset. They had known the power that had been displayed in Legion. They had felt it, seen it, heard it. Some of them maybe even have had scars because of their encounters with the forces of evil at work in Legion. They knew the strength and potency of these dark forces. What they were now seeing in Jesus was a power far greater than what they were used to. And they were afraid, and they asked Jesus to leave the area. It is interesting to note, by the way, as a side note here, that the demons wanted to stay in the area while the people wanted Jesus to leave the area. Well, we pretty much captured the beautiful scene that I wanted to talk about and this discrete event in the life as Mark portrays it. But I want to ask the question, how does this story fit into Mark's big story? The overarching narrative that Mark is trying to tell in his gospel. Well, early on that Mark says that Jesus came to announce and bring the kingdom of God. Now, we've heard that expression before. We've heard it in the words of John the Baptist. We've heard it in the words of Jesus. But what does it mean? Let's stop and think for a minute. I want to suggest that it means the establishment of God's rule. But to take it one step further, what Jesus' announcement means is that the king is coming to reclaim territory that belonged to his Father. You see, sin, disease, darkness, the forces of evil, and death had spread over the landscape. Bit by bit, the enemy had taken over the king's territory. But the area that had been in the hands of the enemy is being recovered and restored. The old regime is being replaced. A new king has arrived. And we see this in the acts of Jesus over and over again. The dead raised, the sick healed, the demon-possessed brought back to wholeness. What does it mean that God, the kingdom of God, is in our midst? Well, let me put it in very modern, current vernacular. What it means is that Jesus is and was a disruption. In the first century, in the lives of Jews and of Gentiles alike, Jesus comes to disrupt the current order. Now, I remember last April and May and June reading things, listening to podcasts in which people would talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, and they would ask the question, this was early on, was this an interruption or was it a disruption? One can imagine similar discussions in the halls of power in Jerusalem in the first century. Is this Jesus guy and what he's doing, is he an interruption or a disruption? They debated. Perhaps similar discussions. In Mark 4:35, Jesus says to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Now, we might just glance right over that phrase and think that basically Jesus is giving directions. We've been on one side of the lake, and now go to the other side of the lake. But this is not how the disciples heard it. Jesus disrupts the current order by going to the Decapolis, the 10 cities, the 10 towns. The other side of the lake was where they lived. See, the Decapolis was primarily occupied by Gentiles. Jews on the one side of the lake, Gentiles on the other. The current understanding in the Jewish community was that the kingdom was for our side, definitely not for the other side. But this kingdom, the kingdom that Jesus was preaching about, was not just for Jews, but for Gentiles as well. And this leads us to one of the signs that Jesus' appearance and preaching was a major disruption. Jesus disrupts the current order by engaging with the unclean. Gentiles are unclean. Jews would become unclean just by being in contact with them. Jesus enters a scene where there is a herd of pigs grazing. Jews had nothing to do with pigs. They were unclean animals, unfit for food. The man who we know as Legion is a Gentile, and that is bad enough, but he is living among the dead. Jews became unclean by having any contact with death or a dead body. Unclean, unclean, unclean. In Jesus' day, Jewish law and custom was, stated positively, all about maintaining purity. Stated negatively, it was all about avoiding uncleanness and impurity. Presented with this situation, Jesus, as an observant Jew, should have run the other way as fast as he could. Perhaps he should never even gotten off the boat. But what do we see in the Gospel of Mark? Jesus is willing to become unclean in order to bring wholeness, healing, and purity. He is willing to aggressively march into enemy territory and bring cleanness and wholeness. We see it in this story, and we see it in the two stories that immediately follow. In the remainder of chapter 5, Mark tells us about Jesus' encounter with the woman who had been suffering from a bleeding issue for 12 years, and Jesus' encounter with Jairus, whose daughter was ill, but who died before Jesus could get to her. Two more situations where Jesus marches into enemy territory, the land of uncleanness, and brings healing and wholeness and life. He touched the unclean woman, or I should say he allowed her to touch him, and he took Jairus' dead daughter by the hand and raised her to life. So, a sign of the disruption of the current order is that Jesus is willing to engage with the unclean. There's a second way that Jesus disrupts the current order, and that is he disrupts the current order by reclaiming the life of a man who had been possessed by an army of demons. Mark tells us and shows us that the king has power over sickness, death, and that he has power over the demons and the forces of evil. Now, this is not the first time, according to Mark, that Jesus had cast out a demon. We read in Mark chapter 1, verses 21 to 28, that Jesus is in a synagogue in Capernaum when one of the other worshipers yells out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus cast out the demon, and Mark tells us that the congregation was amazed. What is this? A new teaching? And with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits, and they obey him. 2 chapters later, we are given an exchange between Jesus and the teachers of the law. Mark 3. We see that they already had come to the place where they could no longer explain away the exorcisms that Jesus was doing, and so they attempt to claim that Jesus' power over the spirits comes from Satan himself. He is possessed by Beelzebul. By the prince of demons, he is driving out demons, was their claim. Jesus' response is that their argument is flawed. A kingdom divided against itself will fall, and therefore, Satan would be divided against Satan. But he goes on to assert the fact that Satan is the strong man, but that he is the stronger man. Jesus says, in fact, no one can enter a strong man's house without first tying him up. Then he can plunder the strong man's house. Chapter 3, verse 27. The local folks in Gerasa had seen the work of the strong man. And now they were in the presence of the stronger man. The kingdom is coming and is here. The king has come back to take the Father's territory and bring wholeness and healing where brokenness had reigned. This is indeed a disruption. And now let's return to the story where we first came in. The episode draws to a conclusion. The people had asked Jesus to leave the Decapolis, and so he agrees to leave. But Legion, or whatever the man's name is, we don't know, he begs Jesus to go along. Take me with you. But Jesus tells him something quite remarkable. He says, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. Now, this is remarkable Because prior to this, when Jesus had healed someone, he told her or him to keep quiet. For example, in Mark 1:43 and 44, Jesus sent a healed leper and gave him these instructions. See that you tell no one, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. They were not to tell anyone. This man was not to tell anyone, and we see this over and over again in Mark. But for this man, Jesus tells him to spread the news. Tell the folks back home what God has done for you. And we find as we read on that indeed the man did. He went all over the Decapolis telling his story. N.T. Wright, a prominent New Testament scholar and theologian, says that our man delivered from the demons, not the Apostle Paul, was the first evangelist or apostle to the Gentiles. So let's go back to the scene where we started. I argue it's a most beautiful picture. A man sitting, clothed, and in his right mind. A tormented man at peace. A man who had been ripped apart, now put back together. A man who suffered the ravages of Satan is now redeemed by the King of Righteousness. But let's be honest, shall we? This beautiful scene is in the midst of a battlefield. Dead pigs, unhappy town folks begging Jesus to leave, beauty in the midst of chaos and carnage. And I think this is the story Mark wants to tell. Scholars feel that Mark wrote his gospel for Gentile believers in Rome in the 60s, not the 1960s. Christians who were already experiencing, these Christians in Rome, were already experiencing persecution and even martyrdom at the hands of Nero, the emperor. What was Mark's goal in telling the story of Jesus to these people? He wanted them to see that the kingdom of love and light established a beachhead when Jesus came to earth. That he was on a mission to reclaim enemy territory, to push back the forces of evil and darkness, to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to bring deliverance to those captive to the forces of evil, to bring beauty and wholeness, to reclaim a man who had been held hostage by a legion of demons. But Mark wants us to see that Jesus also was constantly and bitterly opposed by the leaders of his own people. That he was asked by the Gentiles in this episode to leave the Decapolis, and that he was ultimately betrayed, arrested, and subjected to the worst form of capital punishment. And this Jesus calls us, as his followers, to follow him, to be people who bring disruption, people who bring a message of reconciliation and hope, people who do not retreat into our holy huddle, but who venture to the other side of the lake. People who are willing to risk uncleanness to bring health and wholeness. People who are willing to bring moments of God's beauty to the battlefield. Amen.